Steve Hilton, you used to advise David Cameron. If you were advising Barack Obama tonight, after this vote in Congress, what would you say?
Well, I've argued very publicly here in the US, actually, Christian, for something I think is very important to remember at this time. I know that after what's happened, people are very anxious and very frightened, and they want quick responses. But I think that all our leaders have to understand that this is a long-term fight we're up against this terrible jihadist ideology. And the most important weapon that we need to deploy in that fight is moral clarity and consistency. And that means sticking to our values of openness and compassion and helping the people who are fleeing from exactly the same kind of atrocity that we saw on the streets of Paris. So the very worst thing we can do now is to close our doors to these desperate people who are actually victims of the same enemy that we all are fighting.
And very strange when you're bombing Syria.
I'm sorry?
A very strange thing to do when you are bombing Syria.
We're there because we are trying to fight this enemy, and I think that the action that's been taken so far, you could argue, isn't nearly adequate to the task. But the last thing we should be doing is saying to people who want to live a decent life and who share our values, well, sorry, we're not going to accept you, even though you're in desperate plight. We're going to behave differently to how we've behaved for decades. For families fleeing similar circumstances, not nearly as bad as that, actually. As you pointed out, my family was the beneficiary of that same kind of openness and tolerance, and that's what we should be showing now, because in the end, over the decades that we need to fight this war, we'll only win if we stick to our moral principles.
Well, so you must think then that Europe isn't doing enough either, and Britain in particular, taking, you know, just 4,000 or 5,000 refugees a year.
Well, I don't know exactly what's been the debate in the EU and in the UK. I've been following things here where I live now in America, and I've argued publicly that America needs to be doing much, much more, partly because it can, and also because, although the causes of what's going on are vastly complex and mustn't be oversimplified, it's certainly the case that one contributory factor to what's going on right now and to this stream of desperate refugees is a combination of intervention by America and its allies that has gone wrong and a failure to intervene early enough. And therefore, there is an element of responsibility there, and therefore some responsibility to deal with the problem that those actions have helped to create. And so I've argued that America should be taking not just a few thousand, but hundreds of thousands of refugees. And I think that's the case. That was the case. I argued that before what we saw happen in Paris, and I would stick to that position now.
OK, well, I mean, I know you're still in reasonably close contact with David Cameron, and I also know you're going to be coy about Europe, but he's in a bind right now where he needs to put to Parliament his desire for military action, and he needs a strategy to do that, to convince all the sceptics. What would you advise him? How to convince them?
Well, look, I think that he knows better than anyone the nature of the challenge we're up against, and he is very, very determined to deal with it. And I think that those who would think about standing in the way of that and actually stopping the kinds of actions that might help us defeat this enemy need to really think about the consequences of those actions. And actually look what happened the last time. When we were ready, when the Prime Minister was ready to intervene aggressively in the area where all the problems are coming from right now, was stopped by people in Parliament, they have to think about the impact of that on the events we're seeing right now, today, and last week in Paris.
Now, the last time we spoke to you, Steve Hilton, it was just before the budget, and you flagged up this whole idea of the government embracing a living wage and cutting benefits. Since then, George Osborne has got himself into a terrible mess over tax credits. Lots of his own MPs very worried. What should he do next week?
Well, as I said in relation to the other question, Christian, I'm really not closely following what's going on in the UK.
Well, you do when you want to.
I'm sure that George... Well, I'm really convinced that the last thing that George or anyone else in the government needs from me right now is advice on that very tricky set of issues. But I'm sure that he'll deal with it in the way that he normally does, which is to put forward something that will help move the economy forward and help what the Prime Minister set out in his conference speech as being the driving mission of his premiership, which is to help deal with some of those really deep social problems that have been left to fester in our country for many, many decades. And if you look at what the government's doing on welfare reform as well as economic reform, I think you'll see those twin objectives of improving the economy and helping to strengthen our society. That'll be met in the budget as with all the other things that they're doing right now.
Steve Hilton, thank you very much for joining us.